Hey everyone, it's that time of year again. Compliance training. Gonna do a little different this year because of everything that's going on. How many times have we said, boy, it's an interesting time in which we live. But you know what, before we even get started, I wanna say thanks. As healthcare employees, you've carried a heavy burden over the last 5 or 6 months, and I appreciate what you do. The people you serve appreciate what you do. So I just wanted to say thanks. So yeah, it's been an interesting time. What's changed? Everything. A lot has changed in the last 5 months. 6 months ago, who ever heard of the phrase social distancing? Face masks, face shields, those kind of things? But you know what? Life has to go on. But there's certain things that haven't changed. You know what hasn't changed? Doing the right thing. What's right is always right. That's what we're talking about in compliance. It's really just all about creating that culture where employees do the right thing, the right way, at the right time. That's what it all boils down to. And I always want you to know you have a voice in this organization. If you see something that just doesn't seem right, it just hits you wrong, or you think somebody needs to know, say something to somebody. You can talk to your supervisor. You can call the compliance officer. If you just don't feel like you've got somebody you can talk to, or you want somebody to know what's going on, but you don't want them to know that it was you that brought it forward, you can call the hotline. The number is on the screen. That actually is a toll-free number that rings into my law office that everybody in my office has been trained on how to take a call. You can call, you can make it anonymously if you wish, because we want you to know there is no retaliation for bringing forth a valid concern. We want to know, we want to hear what's going on, not so we can catch people doing things wrong, but so we can correct the problems. Small problems are easy to fix and they're quick to fix. And it's up to all of us, because we're all the eyes and the ears of the compliance program, to say something if we see something that just doesn't seem right. So every couple of years I like to do some definitions, because that sounds fun, doesn't it? Let's talk about what's compliance. What is it really? Well, here's what a lot of people think it really is. It's just something else I have to do. I'm already way too busy. Or this is a rule or regulation that was invented by people who have never done my job. Or some people think compliance is, this is just another way that the management can find me doing things wrong. Compliance is none of that in this organization, I assure you. It is really about creating that culture where employees do the right thing, the right way, at the right time. But why do we even care about compliance? It's this harsh sounding word. I come and talk to you every year, but why do we even care? There are a bunch of reasons that we care about compliance. First and foremost, it's an issue of quality of care. Consistently has shown that organizations that have a strong commitment to compliance provide a higher quality of care. And at the end of the day, isn't that our ultimate objective? To take care of the people you serve in the best way possible? Well, having that compliance program allows us to do that, to move efficiently and effectively according to the regulations and provide that high quality of care. Secondly, having a good compliance program helps us avoid problems with regulators. Nobody loves it when the surveyors come in. And if we're just doing it the right way, the surveyors come in and the surveyors go out much more quickly. And so we avoid those problems when we're doing it the right way, following the rules and regulations. Third, it'll mitigate sanctions and fines, penalties, those kind of things that we may have. The federal government says if something goes bump in the night, and it can happen, things fall through the cracks, yet we've got a solid compliance program in place, the organization can get up to a 90% reduction of fines and penalties for having that program in place. So it can save an organization a great deal of money when something does go wrong. Having a good compliance program helps us avoid litigation, both civil and criminal. Criminal is when somebody has to wear an orange jumpsuit and go to jail. Nobody wants to do that. Also civil, we live in a litigious society where people love to sue organizations for anything. If we're offended or we think somebody did something wrong, we're always looking for somebody to blame. If we have a good compliance program, that allows us to avoid much of that litigation, to establish that we did what we were expected to do according to the rules and regulations. And lastly, we care about compliance because it's our money. Our government doesn't make any goods that it sells to generate revenue. It takes money from us in taxes, redistributes it in the programs that it administers, like Medicare and Medicaid. And so it's our money. Here's just an example of how big the system is. Medicaid alone is about $700 billion. It's a big, that's just Medicaid. Medicare is about 4 times that. Out of that 70 billion, about 700 billion. Out of that 700 billion, about 60 billion a year leaks out, goes to the bad guys, through fraud, waste, and abuse. And that's our money. You think if we had that money back in the system to pay good providers, to good employees like you, it would make a difference on the quality of care that we could provide to individuals, the way we could treat our employees. It would make a huge difference. So we care about fraud, waste, and abuse. We care about compliance because it's our money. So what is fraud, waste, and abuse? I tend to say that like it's all one word, no commas in it, but I think it's important that we break it out. It's all about intent. Abuse is low on the intent scale. It's wrong, and probably not intentionally wrong, but it's still wrong. Fraud is the mother lode. Yes, I know what I'm doing is wrong. I'm fully intending to get something I'm not entitled to get. I know I'm cheating the government. I know I'm cheating individuals. That's fraud. It's the intentional wrongdoing. And there's a great deal of that in the system. Like I do every year, I'm going to give you some cases just to illustrate some of what these people do. And my hope is that you'll look at this and go, I can't imagine somebody would ever do that. But they do. These are all recent cases that have just happened in the last 6 months. And so it's not hard to find cases. The first is U.S. versus Miracle Home Care. When you see U.S. in the caption or the title of a case, that's important because that means it's a federal case. And as I've said before, there's no parole in the federal system. If somebody gets prison time, they're going to do all of that time. So the Miracle Home Care case was a case where this organization was billing for transportation services they didn't provide. Fraudulent billing case. They knew they hadn't provided these transportation trips and episodes, and yet they continued to bill for them. They were non-emergency transportation, and they thought the system was so big they wouldn't get caught. They had name, Social Security number, Medicaid number, what it is, all these individuals that they did legitimate trips for, but they just decided they were going to continue to bill for other trips that they never provided. Thousands of records were falsified to cover up this Medicaid fraud. And it was a big, big case. $10.1 million is what the owner of the company and her company consented to judgments for. $10.1 million. That's a lot of fraudulent trips. But again, it's all about greed. Fraud, waste, and abuse is about greed, trying to get something you're not entitled to. Now, they didn't bill $10 million all at once. They billed for a couple trips. Nobody caught them. Lightning didn't strike. They got away with it. And so they continued to bill, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger to the point here where it's over $10 million. I love the judge's phrase, the act of falsifying records in order to steal millions of dollars from Medicaid will not be tolerated. And that's clearly what they did. They simply falsified the records to steal our money. And it's wrong. Here's another federal case, U.S. versus Erica Miller. She was a personal assistant with an individual with a disability. And she simply didn't provide the services to this individual she said she did. She was supposed to provide personal cares and she didn't. She got the individual to sign off on her time card by doing some kickbacks. She billed for time when she didn't do any work at all. We know that because some of the time she billed for, she was actually in prison. You don't get out on a work release to provide CDAC care when you're in prison. Well, as a result of her fraudulent billing, she got an additional 15 months in prison and she has to pay restitution of over $100,000. Again, purely an issue of greed, just thinking she can get something she's not entitled to get. Here's a case out of St. Louis. Adam was a cardiovascular surgeon, and he practiced what we call unbundling. Medicare and Medicaid say that there are certain services that if you provide those all in one day, it's billed as one charge. Well, he unbundled these services and made it look like he did them on 2 separate days so he could bill 2 separate charges. He got about $2,000 extra per patient for doing it this way, when in fact he did the procedure on the same day, he just billed them the wrong way. It was intentional. He was sentenced to 45 days in prison, and you may think, 45 days isn't that much. Cardiovascular surgeons in prison, they're not going to do so well, so it was a big thing. In addition to that, he had to pay $150,000 plus a fine of $55,000. His company got 3 years probation and paid $120,000. That's just on one side. They also had what's called a False Claims Act settlement. Now, I've talked before about the False Claims Act. That's the Civil War era law that says if you bill the government for goods or services that either you didn't provide or they weren't the quality you said they were, that's a false claim, and that's punishable either civilly or criminally. In this situation, they had a civil False Claims Act action where he paid $1.2 million. So for his extra $2,000 a person he was getting, he ended up paying almost $1.5 million. Now, I put this case in primarily because it is a whistleblower case. A former employee of Dr. Adam came forward and said, hey, this isn't right. This is unbundling, it's not right. And this employee was told, hey, don't worry about it. Not a problem, we've got it taken care of. The employee came forward again and said, stay in your lane, don't worry about it. And the employee got upset, left, found a lawyer, and filed the False Claims Act action. As a result, that whistleblower is going to get $240,000 of that settlement amount. There's an incentive for people to be a whistleblower under the False Claims Act. I never want you to feel like you have to be a whistleblower in this organization. Whistleblowers are almost always former employees who tried. They tried to do the right thing. They tried to say something. They tried to say, hey, this isn't right. And they get pushed aside and they get frustrated because they don't feel like they have a voice. And they quit and they file a False Claims Act action. They become a whistleblower. You have a voice in this organization. Talk to your supervisor. Talk to the compliance officer. You can call the hotline number. It's posted several places in the organization. You have a voice. I never want you to feel like you don't have some place to bring forth a concern. So it's very important that you know that. Here's another federal case. Suzanne May, she was an RN, a nurse, and the administrator of a hospice organization in Louisiana. Now, in 2015, Medicare came in to do an audit. They do that periodically. And they discovered that she really had bad documentation. In fact, she didn't have sufficient documentation to support the claims for payment that she had submitted. So in return, Medicare said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take back $383,000. We're going to claw that back out of future payments because we don't think you were justified in that. You probably provided the services, but you don't have the documentation. And we're going to give you a letter of instruction. We're going to teach you what you need to do so going forward you do it right. The problem is, going forward, Suzanne May didn't do it right. Medicare came back in 2017. They always circle back to make sure that you're doing it right. She knew they still did not have good documentation. She testified at trial that she and other employees sat around and altered or falsified documentation to try to support those claims for payment. They knew they didn't have the medical records they need. They even placed whiteout on records, like that's not a red flag, but they used whiteout on records to make it look like Suzanne May had seen these patients as a nurse when in fact she hadn't. As a result of this second wrongdoing, she got 5 years in prison, $250,000 fine, and 3 years of supervised release after that. They gave her a chance. They gave her a letter of instruction, and she still didn't do what was right. So the moral of that story is when the regulators come in and tell you what you need to do, then it's time to start doing what they say you need to do. But Suzanne May knew she didn't. Clearly a case of intentional fraud. Case of U.S. versus Hope Falawo. This is an interesting case. Falawo worked as a personal care attendant, but she worked for 12 different agencies. She was kind of a subcontractor, a free agent, we call them. And she worked for a lot of different agencies. And when she was submitting her time slips, when you totaled them all up, they were more than 24 hours in a day. And she was paying kickbacks to the beneficiaries to get them to sign off on it. Like she'd get paid $100 for a shift and she'd give them 25 or 40 bucks to sign off on it. So she was still making money. She claimed services when she wasn't even in the country. She just fraudulently submitted her time slips more than 24 hours a day when she's not even around. Right now she's looking at up to 2 years in federal prison, $250,000 in fine, $316,000 in restitution, and forfeiture money judgment. The forfeiture money judgment says they can go out and take her assets to sell, house, car, boat, whatever it may be, to try to satisfy that judgment. So they're pretty serious about that. Here's a case out of my home state of Missouri. Donna Dixon was a professional counselor, and she submitted claims for payment saying that she provided counseling services to various children. She said she provided these services to the children while they were in their home. The problem is they were able to cross-check and figure out that a lot of times the kids she was serving were actually in the hospital and she didn't see them at all. She created false documentation to make it look like she had seen them. Get the theory that false documentation is a big trend that we see in fraud, waste, and abuse. The government cares a lot about documentation, therefore we have to. Don Dixon was sentenced to 5 years of prison in the Missouri system and has to pay back $3,200. So $3,200, not a great deal of money. You know, your compliance officer probably has that in their purse or wallet right now as they're walking around money. The point is, little fraud or big fraud, it's all wrong. It doesn't matter if it's $1 of fraud or $1 million in fraud, it's wrong, and Medicaid Fraud Control Unit will go for it. And so a lot of people think, oh, it's little, faceless crime, no big deal. The government cares. 5 years in prison for $3,200. It's a pretty stiff price to pay. This case is out of Massachusetts, Michael Davini. He had another company, this is another transportation case, and he billed for services that he didn't provide. He said he provided non-emergency medical wheelchair transport for individuals who turned out to actually be ambulatory. They didn't need a wheelchair. Many of these people didn't ever have these services at all. He didn't provide those trips. Just like Falawo, he paid kickbacks to the individuals to sign off on that the trips were provided, and so he could then bill Medicaid for them. Got a year in jail, 5 years supervised probation, restitution of $4.2 million. These transportation fraud cases turn out to be very big, and they're 20, 30 bucks at a time, so they bill a huge number of these. It's intentional. They start small, they get away with it, and they continue to bill. The next case, U.S. versus Sandra Har, again, another federal case. It's kind of an interesting case. Comes out of Merced, California, and she had a service, a company that provided dental services to Medicaid beneficiaries. And she billed $3.7 million for services that she knew weren't reimbursable. They weren't medically necessary. Medicare and Medicaid say they'll pay for services that are reasonably provided and medically necessary. These weren't. And at times, Sandra Har actually billed as if these people had seen a licensed physician, when in fact they were told to meet her in the parking lot of a drugstore or a McDonald's, and she gave them a little baggie of narcotics. But she billed as if it was a doctor's appointment. I can't even fathom the idea of, you go to see your doctor and, yeah, meet me in the McDonald's parking lot and I'll give you a Ziploc bag of your medication. Nonetheless, proves you don't have to be smart to be a thief. That's what happened with Sandra Har. 5 years in prison, $6 million in restitution. Again, large fraud, small fraud, doesn't matter. And it's amazing how creative some of these people are. Again, you don't have to be smart to be a criminal. So that's fraud. That's intentionally doing something that's wrong. Next on the scale, a little lower down on the intent scale, is abuse. That's where I probably know it's wrong, but I'm going to kind of abuse the system. I'm going to do some practices that probably aren't consistent with reasonable medical standard, that probably aren't really in line with the regulations. I'm going to provide some services that aren't medically necessary. I'm going to provide the services and I'm going to bill for them, but I probably didn't need to provide those services, and therefore the taxpayers shouldn't have to pay for them. We have a case out of Carroll, Iowa that illustrates this, U.S. versus Tracy Wellendorf. Dr. Wellendorf is an ENT in Carroll, and he provided, at this point, 115 medically unnecessary services to Medicaid beneficiaries. He was doing the balloon procedure, the sinus balloon procedure on people that didn't need it. He paid $1 million in a settlement to resolve that claim, and it was more than just the money. The government was upset because he provided medical services to people who didn't need it. Therefore, he exposed them to some degree of medical risk. Even this kind of procedure is relatively routine, but there's still a risk that goes along with it. And the fact that because of his greed, he exposed those individuals to some potential harm, the government was in his kitchen, so to speak, for the next 3 years under a corporate integrity agreement and $1 million in payment. So then there's waste. That's the lower end of the scale. That's no intent typically. That's the situation of, hey, if I don't spend my budget this year, they're going to take it away from me. So I'm going to replace this equipment even though it's still functional. I'm going to overprescribe antibiotics just because I want to go over. And it's abusing the system in that we're utilizing resources that don't need to be used. And what that does it takes those resources away from other people that probably need them, and it costs us, the taxpayers, money. Don't have a lot of cases to show on waste because they never get to the level of civil or criminal actions. So the question is, okay, all this fraud, waste, and abuse, Gary, big deal, what's it matter? How does it impact the system? Well, it impacts the system because it costs us money. As I said, this is our money as taxpayers. So it takes money out of our pocket. Secondly, it diverts assets away from those that legitimately need the services, but they can't be paid for because those assets have been exhausted. When I grow up, I want to be the guy that comes up with the names for police operations. I love this one. It's called Operation Root Canal. It's against a dentist, Dr. Santa Maria McKibbins. Dr. McKibbins provided a lot of services that weren't medically necessary. Kind of the pulling wisdom teeth when they don't need to come out, those kind of things that happen. And she had no documentation to support the services that she was asking to be paid for. $375,000 in settlement. Just again, she was providing services kind of that didn't need to be provided. They weren't medically necessary. So it kind of falls into the waste situation, kind of falls into the abuse. Here's a case out of Tennessee, which I think is very interesting. Tennessee is very serious about Medicaid fraud. Christine Bolin was trying to qualify for Tennessee Medicaid, which is called TennCare. She represented to TennCare that she had custody of her 3 children. In Tennessee, it's a sliding scale qualification method for Medicaid. If you make a certain amount based on the number of kids, you can qualify or not. If she had custody of her 3 children, she would qualify for Tennessee Medicaid. She said that she did, when in fact, she did not have custody of those children. So she intentionally misled the Tennessee system, and she diverted assets away from beneficiaries that really needed those assets to provide services. The judge said it's our duty to ensure Tennessee taxpayers' money is being used for the right purposes. Right now, she's looking at 24 years in jail on 2 felony charges. Now, she probably won't get 24 years, but the fact that she's looking at the potential of that, because I said they're very serious about this. Did she think it was a crime? She probably knew it was wrong. She probably thought, no big deal, no harm, no foul, I'm just going to get mine. When in fact, again, it's stealing taxpayer money and diverting those assets. Here's another case out of Tennessee, the case of Tamaria Whitley. Tamaria Whitley allowed somebody else to use her Medicaid card 12 times to receive dental services. She knew that person didn't qualify for Medicaid. She knew it wasn't her going for those medical services, but she allowed this individual to use the card 12 times. $7,500 in improper payments. Again, not a huge amount, but $7,500 of Medicaid dollars that went to pay this dentist for services that the taxpayers shouldn't pay for. Again, she also is looking at up to 24 years in prison for fraud and identity theft. They're serious about this. And again, it's the idea of it's a faceless crime. Here, just use my card. Well, it's not a faceless crime. It's very serious. So that's how it impacts the system. When there's fraud, waste, and abuse, how does it impact the agency, the organization you work for? Well, it can have a huge impact. First and foremost, it is a tremendous drain on assets. When you have to go in and respond to an investigation, pull together documents, be parts of investigations and interviews, it takes a lot of time and energy and money away from an organization. Secondly, there is a huge potential for reputational hit. We all want to work for organizations that are seen as doing things the right way. When it hits the paper that there's fraud in our organization, it reflects on all of us. It reflects on the reputation of the organization as a whole. And then there's a financial impact. There could be fines, there could be penalties, not to mention what's called the opportunity cost. That we're spending all of our time responding to the investigation. We're not able to provide other services that maybe we could be paid for. So there's a big impact on the system. There's a huge impact on the agency. Here's a case out of Sioux City, Iowa that can illustrate that. Lisa Preston worked for an organization in Sioux City, and she was in charge of the rep payee account. The resident trust fund account and a long-term care, they're the same thing. It's handling the people you serve, it's handling their money. And she basically stole $85,000 from those rep payee accounts. Used it to take trips, buy furniture. I actually used to do training in the organization that Lisa was working at. She was the office manager. And I used to talk about how it was great. I love coming here because they had the best donuts. Well, now I know why. She was using somebody else's money to pay for those things. This is a really, really good organization. They're solid. They have a good compliance program. Things go bump in the night. People make bad decisions. As a result, Lisa Preston was convicted of 2 counts of dependent adult abuse, second-degree theft, and got 10 years in prison. People make bad decisions. Not long after Lisa was arrested, we had people come forward and say, I thought something was kind of different about her the last couple of years. If you see something, say something. If you see one of your fellow employees just starting to act differently, doing something that just doesn't seem right, say something. Say something to somebody so that it can be investigated, it can be looked into, because we might have been able to catch this much sooner than it really did. But luckily, she was caught. So let's talk about some of the other enforcement actions that have come out recently, because I think they're interesting and they kind of illustrate some of the issues that are out there. Florida versus Hames is an interesting case. This is a situation where a coworker saw Hames take a disabled individual that they provided services to down to the floor, punched him repeatedly, forced his head into a towel so that he could barely breathe. And Hames was convicted. He's looking at 15 years in prison, $10,000 in fines. The important part of this case is the coworker did the right thing. The coworker saw something and immediately said something. And that's important because the immediacy is important. What happens a lot of times, somebody sees something like this and it bothers them. They go home, they talk to their spouse or their mate over the weekend and think, what? I'm going to go tell my boss what I saw on Friday. Well, the problem is, in most organizations, we've got a regulation that says we've got to report that to the state immediately, no later than 24 hours. If you think about it over the weekend, we've already missed the 24-hour period. It is important to do the right thing the right way at the right time. Before you leave work each day, ask yourself, did I see anything today that I need to let somebody know about? Not that we want to create this atmosphere of everybody snitching on one another, but there are regulations we have to follow, and it's important that if there's potential abuse, that it be dealt with immediately. So before you leave work each day, if you see something like happened here with Hames, say something to somebody. Give us the opportunity to investigate it. Give us the opportunity to report it appropriately. Here's another case out of Florida, Chantel Guion. She was the employee of a skilled nursing facility, and she talked a resident into giving her a loan, and that resident wrote her a check. Then Chantel took that check. She had the routing number and she had the account number, and she went on her computer and used Adobe and Photoshop and made fraudulent checks and started passing fraudulent checks around town because she had all the information, and she just stole money from this resident. Because of this fraud, she's looking at 5 years in prison and $5,000 fine. Yet another case out of Florida. They have a very active attorney general there. Alex and Colonia Bellamy owned several group homes for disabled individuals. And much like several of the other cases, they just took these individuals' money. Just like Lisa Preston took the rep payee accounts. That's what these people did. They used more than $10,000 of these residents' money to fund their lifestyle. Now, they at least renewed their driver's license, so they were driving legally as criminals. But the fact is, they stole this money from these individuals, not thinking about the fact that it wasn't theirs. They didn't care. And that's financial abuse of the individuals. All sorts of things get rolled into that. They were convicted of felony exploitation and misuse of personal identification information. They haven't been sentenced yet. It's a brand new case. But the fact of the matter is, who thinks that's okay? If you see somebody just doing something like that or they mention it, say something to somebody. Case of U.S. versus Nikita Chesney. Nikita Chesney worked in an organization that provided psychotherapy services to individuals. And she had all their information. 2 other people came to Nikita Chesney and said, here's what we're going to do. We want you to bring us that information. We're going to set up kind of a sham company, and we're going to bill for psychotherapy services that we never provide. But because you get us the information, the name, date of birth, social security number, Medicaid number, they're going to think it's legitimate services. We can set it up and make it look like it's legit. And they promised to share the proceeds with Nikita Chesney. So she took the information of 150 people from her employer and gave it to these individuals. She got 7 months in prison. The people who came up with the scam got more because it was their idea, but 7 months in prison and $1.369 million in restitution. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a job when you're in prison, you make 50 cents an hour. Do any of us think that the taxpayers are ever going to get their $1.3 million back? It's not going to happen. That's where the fraud, waste, and abuse leaks out of the system, the $60 billion I told you about earlier. Fraud, waste, and abuse takes every form you can imagine. I've shown you some examples of some very creative ways to cheat the government out of our money. Doesn't matter what form it takes, they're all wrong. As taxpayers, we care about that because it's our money and we want those assets to go to the people who need them. Now, I want to close the presentation with just a little review about some topics that we've covered in the past that I think are important for review. We're going to talk a little bit about social media, about why documentation really matters, because that's everybody's favorite part of their job, I understand that, and a little bit about mobile devices and cell phones. So, social media. You know, in this time of COVID and the pandemic, people have lost their mind. You look at the things that go on social media, the shaming, the political views, things, people have been cooped up, and it seems like social media has exploded as a platform for people to just get everything out there that they need to get out because they're not having social interaction. Many healthcare organizations utilize social media very effectively. It's a great tool for recruitment, putting out the news, promotion, those kind of things. But it has been co-opted as the platform that people want to use. And as a result, we have a lot of issues. It's blurred the lines of ethics. Social media is a faceless communication. People will say things on social media that they would never say in person. They would never walk up to you on the street and say something like that, but they'll say it on social media because there's no immediate feedback, there's no immediate ramification for their actions. And people have become more and more bold about how they do things. So what are the dangers for social media in the healthcare setting? HIPAA is a big issue. Sharing of information is so easy. All you do is hit send and it goes out to the world. It used to be a HIPAA breach was if I left papers out on a desk, somebody could see that, they had to memorize it, they had to write it on their hand, so they'd take a picture on their phone. But now that information can go out there, and here's how it happens. You have a parent or a guardian or a loved one that goes on a rant, because that never happens. They go on a rant about the care that their loved one received. They don't understand that they can't go see their loved one because the facility's in a lockdown or something like that. And they go on this big rant. And a well-intentioned employee, somebody who's trying to do the right thing, tries to set the record straight and says, no, the reason Gary has to be in this situation is because he's got an underlying health condition. He's got asthma or something like that. That's where the breach happens. It's the sharing of protected health information, well-intentioned, that's where the breach can happen. And so because we don't think that much, we don't use our filters when it's on social media, the potential for a HIPAA breach is huge. And the level of awareness of the stakeholders has skyrocketed. People are super sensitive to their information being out there because we hear all the stories all the time about breaches and about cybersecurity. And so people understand and they're much more apt to file a complaint when information's out there that it shouldn't be out there. We live in a world of reality show mentality. Think about it. When Fear Factor came out and people were eating bugs, we thought, oh man, that's horrible. How can anybody do that just for money? Now we have people that will get naked, go into the wilds of Africa with somebody they've never met, and spend 3 weeks together. Who does that? Fame. It's not even fortune. They don't get paid for naked and alone. But the fact that it's the fame, the notoriety, the one-upmanship, the attention. And so many people are seeking that attention, that's what we get. We have this reality show mentality. Everything's got to be bigger and better than the next guy. It's that one-upmanship. And so the danger of social media is somebody's going on a rant, and then somebody else says, well, let me tell you about my day. I work in a place that had a COVID outbreak or whatever. And again, we have the potential for sharing of information that's not appropriate to share. So it is thinking through how we use social media. That it's not a reality show. We're not trying to one-up. And if we're using it to get attention, that's one thing. We're not to use the information, protected health information, to get that attention. So let's talk about documentation. Everybody loves documentation. But I will tell you, and I've said it before, it's just as important as the care you provide. But why? Why is it important? What does it matter? Number one, what we call program integrity. It is the very start, the foundation of the payment process. Without good documentation, the organization can't get paid. I gave you several cases of fraudulent documentation where the organization did not get paid for the services they were provided, or somebody had to pay restitution. Documentation is very important to the government, and it provides that foundation to say, you know what, we need to pay this organization for the services they provided. We know they provided them because here's the documentation to support it. Next is quality of care. If you're going to come onto a shift, is it important for you to know what's happened in that individual's life in the previous 12, 24 hours? Was there a bad home visit? Was there a medication change? Were there behaviors? Is this resident, going downhill? Whatever it may be, it's important to know that. And the only way we have to have that continuity of care is through good documentation that tells the story of that person's life. Because that's what documentation really is. It's taking the time to tell the story of what happened in that individual's life and how we impacted that life through the cares and the services that we provided. Third reason it matters, and the reason that most people don't think about, is it protects you and the organization. Think about this. You can't answer me because we're on a video, but think about, what did you have for lunch 4 days ago? You probably don't know. I can't remember what I had for lunch 4 days ago. But can I remember what happened on a shift 4 years ago? Absolutely not. Let's assume there's litigation. The organization gets sued because something happens. You get sued because something happens. There's a lawsuit that has nothing to do with you or the organization, but the care that was provided to that individual on that day is important for some reason. And you're called upon to testify as to what happened on that shift on August 6th of 2020, and we're 2024, because that's how long it takes for litigation to typically work its way through the court system or through a deposition. Are you going to know what happened? The only way you have to know what happened on a particular date is to go back and do what's called refresh your recollection through that documentation. You can read that and go, yep, I know what happened. Here's what I did because I made this documentation at the time I provided the services, and so I know what I did. As opposed to guessing, and if it's not in writing, we all know it didn't happen. And so that protection for you to know that you provided the services you were supposed to provide on that date for the organization, for you, is huge. So I want you to think on that day when you're tired, it's been a tough shift, you were bit, hit, kicked, spit on, screamed at just by your supervisor. It's one of those tough days, you got to leave to pick up the kids, you've got a hot day, you got to get to baseball, whatever it may be, and you want to cut the corners. I'm going to cut and paste what I did yesterday because today was just like yesterday. The resident didn't do anything different today. I'm just going to put all the stuff in there. Think to yourself, is this the shift? Is this the shift 4 years from now? I'm going to have to testify as to what I did. Take those moments. Do the documentation correctly. It's very, very important. As I said, the government cares about it, the organization cares about it, and we should care about it for all of these reasons. A little bit about mobile devices. They have become such a part of our world. Laptops, tablets, cell phones. Think about it. If you don't know where your kids are for 5 or 6 hours, you kind of start to think about it. You figure they're going to come home eventually. You don't know where your cell phone is for 5 minutes. We freak out. We all want to know where that is. We are tied to those devices. And that's okay. And we can have protected health information on our mobile device if we do a few things. Number one, we've got to have all the same technical and administrative safeguards on that phone that we would have as if that PHI was on our desktop computer. Encryption, passwords, those kind of things, they've got to be there. Just having a policy about electronic protected health information on our phone is not enough. Nobody wants to carry two phones. I got my work phone, I've got my personal phone, and we carry them both with us because we can't set one of them down. If we want to have our email on our personal phone, it's got PHI on it, there's certain things we have to do. And that's why, we're concerned about loss, theft of that device. Cell phones get lost. People steal mobile devices. Are they stealing them to try to get PHI? Probably not. They're probably getting them to try to sell it for $50. But if we can't ensure the security of that information, we can't account for it at all times, it's a HIPAA breach. And those can get very expensive. So we've got to keep our systems updated. Having information on our own phone really creates a lot of issues. And there's certain things that the employer can do to make sure that it's there. So what are the rules? Number one, we need to have a policy. We all need to understand how we're to use mobile devices in the world of healthcare because they're not going away. It's always going to be there. We have to have basic mobile security. We have to have a password on our phone. It's got to be more than 1, 2, 3, 4. That's not a password, you guys, but a lot of people still have that. 5, 6, 8 characters is far more secure than 4. Having encryption. Encryption can be a pain. HIPAA can be a pain. But the fact of the matter is, if a device is encrypted and it gets lost or stolen, I don't care. because the bad guys don't have the de-encryption key and they can't get the information that may be on that phone. It's basically a paperweight for them. And so encryption, while it's that second step of having to open your phone, can cure a lot of ills. And so it's very important if we're going to have PHI in our phone, that phone be encrypted. Every single smartphone has the capability to be encrypted. It's built into the operating system. Again, having long passwords, having what's called a kill switch, the ability to remotely disable that phone if it's lost or stolen. And that's a pretty serious remedy. Here's what typically happens is somebody comes in and says, I lost my phone, I've looked everywhere, I can't find it. I'll say, okay, are you sure? Because we're gonna put the kill switch on it. Yep, I can't find it anywhere. We put the kill switch on, it's disabled. They come in the next day, hey, I found my phone. And it's like, no, you found your paperweight, because that phone is disabled, it's no longer capable to be used. But that's a remedy that we need to have on there if we're gonna have electronic protected health information on our mobile devices. Having security patches and updates installed immediately. I was always one of those guys that I hated when I get the notification from Apple that says the iOS need to be updated. I hated it, I wouldn't do it. It'd tell me you want to do it tonight, I'd schedule it later. And finally Apple would say, you have to do it. We're not going to let your phone go. Because I didn't want to do it because it was going to move my icons, something wasn't going to work. Well, I realized that the reason those patches are in place is because there's a known vulnerability. And if Apple or Samsung know about it, the bad guys know about it too, and they can exploit those vulnerabilities. So if you get notification of a security update or a patch, install it immediately. Keep your phone up to date. And having effective training, letting people know what the rules are for mobile devices is really, really important. I've given you this case before, the Catholic Healthcare Services case. One lost iPhone had the PHI of 412 people on it in an email. And it cost the company $650,000 because of one lost iPhone, and they didn't have the protocols and the phone wasn't encrypted. We have to take these steps, they're very important. Here's a case that's hot off the press. We're filming this early August of 2020. Here's a case from the end of July 2020. Lifespan Health Services paid a little over $1 million to settle potential HIPAA violations. There was a laptop computer that was stolen. It wasn't encrypted, had the PHI of about 20,000 people on it in a big spreadsheet. Somebody just stole the laptop. Were they trying to get that spreadsheet? Probably not. But the fact of the matter is, that PHI was no longer secure. They found that there was systemic non-compliance with HIPAA in that they didn't have encryption, they didn't have the policies and procedures they need, they didn't do the training they need to do, they didn't have business associate agreements in place. As a result, they got to pay $1 million for one lost laptop. That's pretty expensive. So it's important for us to consider fraud, waste, and abuse in the healthcare system and everything that we do, whether it be intentional, whether it be unintentional, just wrong, thinking about how those assets are utilized on a daily basis. Think about what's the role of social media. How do we use social media in our personal life, and how does it impact our life as a worker in the healthcare field? Documentation, again, I know everybody's favorite part. It really does matter. It's vital for payment, it's vital for protection, it's vital for quality of care. And lastly, thinking about mobile devices, how we utilize them, how we protect them, where the vulnerabilities may be on a daily basis. Compliance is all about that culture of employees doing the right thing, the right way, at the right time. If you see something, say it immediately, because that's when it's right to do that. You've got a voice in this organization. If you see something that doesn't seem right, or just you want somebody to know, talk to your supervisor. Talk to the compliance officer, or you can call the toll-free hotline number that's on the line. Well, I've enjoyed the video presentation this year. Hopefully we'll be back in person next year. If you have questions about this, talk to your compliance officer. If they have other questions, they can give me a call. Otherwise, take care, and again, thanks for what you do.